At least once every week, I go to the DCRI site in order to see what's going on. Sometimes twice a week. There's always interesting material there. Maybe for once I've got a leg up on them because I am with Dr. Michael Felker, who is from Duke Clinical Research Institute, and we're talking about a paper that he has a commentary in Jack. It's the Pontiac Trial that you're talking about. Are they driving us to a new world here with natriuretic peptides and primary prevention? What a concept. Talk about the Pontiac Trial that you were commenting on in Jack.
Yeah, well, I think, this whole issue of heart failure prevention is an incredibly important issue. There's millions of people, about 5 million people just in the U.S. alone with heart failure, but they're just the tip of the iceberg compared to the much larger population at risk for heart failure. So either patients just with risk factors or patients who have underlying structural heart disease like LVH or ischemic heart disease but haven't gone on to develop heart failure yet. So really the big challenge is how can we prevent this giant bolus of people who are at risk from going on to develop heart failure, which we know is a really expensive condition for the health system as well as obviously a terrible thing for patients. So the challenge with prevention is that there's such a large group at risk. How do you target both in terms of trial design and also just in terms of implementing a strategy? How can you figure out who's at the greatest risk and has the most chance to benefit? So that's really where this idea of natriuretic peptide guided prevention, you might call it, is coming from. And the natriuretic peptides, we started understanding how they work in heart failure as biomarkers with the sickest patients, and now we're gradually moving them from beyond heart failure to patients with ACS or ischemic heart disease, and now finally to sort of the patients at risk for heart failure. So Pontiac, very interesting trial, small trial, only a few hundred patients, so I think it's really just sort of a pilot for a larger enterprise, but basically looking at diabetic patients. It's a group we already know has a high risk for going on to develop heart failure, but trying to select out by using natriuretic peptides, in this case NT-proBNP, those patients who are at the highest risk, and then randomizing them to usual care, which was still a quite good diabetes management strategy, or intensive sort of heart failure prevention care, which involves consultation with a cardiologist and in particular focused use of beta blockers and RAS inhibitors. And what they found, even in a relatively small trial, was a dramatic reduction in events in the patients who were randomized to the intensive arm. And again, these are patients who had no evidence or clinical history of heart failure beforehand. So this comes out at the same time as another trial with a similar design, STOP-HF, which was just published also this year, and similar findings. So I think these two, both relatively small, single country studies, both very intriguing for how we can take natriuretic peptides from sort of end-stage heart failure and diagnosis to use them in prevention to target the most appropriate.
Were there any signals of negative effects?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, one of the challenges when you apply this intensive therapy to a group of patients who don't yet have a disease is, are you going to make them worse? You can't tolerate very much risk in prevention because you're but actually the safety profile of these agents was quite good, and that's very reassuring because there's at least some theoretical concern with beta blockers and diabetics, and also with RAS inhibitors in patients who have maybe potentially compromised renal function. So what was interesting is we didn't actually see in either of these trials a major safety concern. Now, again, with small trials, you always have to be careful because often when you extrapolate to broader populations, more heterogeneous populations, maybe less expert sites, you find that the safety benefit profile can potentially change. So I think, not a definitive answer, but certainly a very intriguing, both with regard to the specific trial and also sort of the broader implications of how we can think about prevention of heart failure, which I think is a key unmet goal with our current strategies.
I mean, like you said, this is a huge population of patients. Anything we can do to help would be certainly beneficial.
I mean, I think obviously once you develop heart failure, both in terms of the patient's individual prognosis and also the burden on the health system and society, the cost of recurrent hospitalizations really becomes substantial. So prevention is obviously key as long as it can be done in a way that's evidence-based. It's a challenge to do trials in prevention because you have to start with a big cohort of patients and you have to follow them for a long time to have sufficient power. So these are very expensive or lengthy trials to do potentially. And so that's another potential advantage of this sort of natriuretic peptide guided strategy is you're targeting the people at most risk, and you can show a benefit in a higher risk group that's smaller trials and get these ideas out into practice earlier.
Well, please make sure you go to your JACC issue or go online and read Dr. Felker's commentary, as well as the original paper on the Pontiac Trial for CardioSource World News. I'm Executive Editor Rick McGuire.